A cold March night in 1944. Nazi-occupied Paris lies in darkness under curfew. But from the chimney at 21 Rue Le Sueur in the upscale 16th arrondissement, thick, foul-smelling smoke billows relentlessly. Neighbors wrinkle their noses at the acrid stench of burning flesh invading their homes. Over several days, black smoke continues to pour from the townhouse's chimney, well beyond any normal fireplace use. Worried residents finally alert the authorities, fearing a chimney fire or worse. This once elegant three-story home, formerly owned by a French princess, now emanates a presence of dread. It's Saturday, March 11th, 1944, just before dawn. Two police officers arrive on bicycles to investigate. They find the house apparently unoccupied, the door locked and bearing a handwritten note, away for 1 month. Forward mail to 18 Rue des Lombards aux Airs, a curious message in wartime Paris. Neighbors report that the owner, Dr. Marcel Petiot, hasn't been seen there in some time, though many mysterious visitors had been coming and going at odd hours in recent months. Some recall late-night arrivals by a stranger with a horse-drawn cart, and a pair of trucks one day hauling suitcases and heavy sacks in and out of the property. Something about number 21 Rue Le Sueur has been deeply wrong for a long time. As the smoke intensifies, firefighters are summoned. They force entry through a second-story window and cautiously make their way down to the basement by lantern light. What they discover in the cellar shocks even these hardened men. They stumble upon a large coal-burning stove roaring at full blast, and from its open iron door a human arm dangles, charred and grotesque. One fireman staggers back, vomiting at the horrific sight and the sickly sweet smell of incinerated flesh. Scattered on the basement floor are piles of human bones, skull fragments, and body parts, some partly burned, others bloodied and dismembered. In the dim, smoky chamber, it is impossible to tell how many victims lie in this tableau of grisly disarray. The stunned chief firefighter turns to the police officers, his face ashen, and warns, "You have some work ahead of you." The officers retreat upstairs to catch their breath, just as a man arrives at the scene, pedaling up on a bicycle. He is Dr. Marcel Petiot himself, a stocky middle-aged Frenchman with a physician's black bag. Petiot gazes at the smoke belching from his own basement and the policeman at his door. "This is serious," he mutters calmly. "My head could be at stake." Yet his demeanor is eerily composed. He eyes the uniformed men and asks quietly, "You're all French? No Germans?" Satisfied that no Gestapo agents are present, Petiot proceeds to spin an astonishing tale. He claims that the butchered corpses below are Germans and traitors, enemies of France whom he has executed as part of a secret resistance operation. He introduces himself not as a murderer, but as the head of a resistance group, a patriot doing his duty. In a brisk tone, the doctor warns the officers that he must urgently leave to destroy documents, supposedly lists of resistance contacts, at his other residence before the Gestapo finds them. The policemen exchange uncertain glances. It's 1944, and for years they've served under German orders. Could this grisly scene truly be the work of a patriotic avenger targeting Nazi collaborators? The French officers, embittered by the occupation, hesitate. An urgent order crackles over the radio, by command of the German authorities. Dr. Petiot is to be arrested immediately as a dangerous lunatic. But the Germans are hated overlords. The French cops delay in the confusion. Marcel Petiot slips away into the night, vanishing before anyone musters the will to stop him. The house on Rue Le Sueur is now a crime scene of almost unspeakable horror, and its owner, a respected doctor turned phantom, is at large. Cut to black. The audience is left with burning questions. Who is Marcel Petiot? How did a kindly doctor come to preside over this charnel house of death? And what evil unfolded within the walls of 21 Rue Le Sueur during Paris's darkest days? To understand the monster behind the madness, we must step back in time. Marcel André Henry Félix Petiot was born on January 17, 1897, in Auxerre, a quiet town in central France. By all accounts, his childhood was deeply troubled. Petiot was remarkably intelligent as a boy, but that brightness came wrapped in disturbing behaviors. Family stories and later psychiatric examinations revealed a profoundly antisocial young mind. In fact, Marcel's own life seemed to prefigure a macabre checklist of budding sociopathy. As a toddler, he exhibited cruelty to animals, the classic warning sign. One anecdote describes 3-year-old Marcel trying to drown a pet cat, and when that failed, smothering it to death. He was also plagued by persistent enuresis, bedwetting into his preteen years. This combination of animal cruelty and childhood incontinence is notable. Decades later, psychiatrists would dub such patterns the McDonald triad and link them to violent tendencies in adulthood. Whether or not one believes in that theory, young Petiot certainly fit the profile. He was frequently truant and unruly in school, expelled multiple times for disruptive behavior and petty theft. At 17, he was arrested for stealing from a public letterbox, but a judge deemed him mentally unfit to stand trial and dismissed the charges. A psychiatric evaluation diagnosed adolescent Marcel with mental illness and obsessive-depressive tendencies, prompting short stays in mental hospitals. Even before adulthood, Marcel Petiot's dark impulses were evident, lurking beneath a veneer of intellect. Despite these early red flags, Petiot managed to mask his instability well enough to pursue higher education. When World War I erupted, 19-year-old Petiot volunteered for the French army in 1916. The war itself seemed to deepen his troubles. He saw combat in the trenches, a cauldron of horror that left him gassed and shocked, suffering a nervous breakdown at the front. He spent time in military psychiatric wards, where he was caught stealing morphine, blankets, and personal items from other patients. Military doctors described him with a litany of diagnoses: depression, melancholia, phobias, neurasthenia, essentially confirming Petiot's unstable psyche. Remarkably, he returned to duty before the war's end, but soon contrived to injure himself reportedly by a grenade to his own foot, and finally secured a discharge in 1919 on psychological disability. The French army was glad to be rid of the strange, erratic soldier from Auxerre. Freed from military service, Petiot raced through an accelerated medical program for war veterans, somehow managing to earn an MD by 1921. It's chilling to imagine. This deeply disturbed young man, now an accredited physician sworn to do no harm, but Petiot seemed eager to leave his troubled past behind. He set up his first medical practice in the small village of Villeneuve-sur-Yonne. In that close-knit community, Dr. Petiot initially gained trust and even a bit of fame. Charismatic and quick-witted, he cultivated an image as a dedicated country doctor. Villagers found him charming, generous with consultations, and notably intelligent. In 1926, at just 29 years old, Petiot was elected mayor of Villeneuve. Such was his popularity. Yet behind the façade of the kindly village doctor, Petiot's darker proclivities persisted. Whispered rumors followed him like a shadow. Patients spoke of his willingness to perform illegal abortions for the right price, and to supply addictive narcotics with few questions asked. During his mayorship, town funds mysteriously disappeared. Petiot was later convicted of fraud for embezzling municipal money and briefly suspended from office. Far more sinister was the disappearance of Louise Delavaux, a young woman rumored to be Petiot's lover. In May 1926, just months after she'd moved in as his maid and reportedly became pregnant by him, Louise vanished. Her decapitated corpse was found in a river soon after. Suspicion fell on Dr. Petiot, but with no hard evidence, the death was dismissed by police as a runaway case. The villagers had their own doubts, especially when a local bar owner, who gossiped about Petiot's possible role in Louise's death, turned up murdered as well. Petiot emerged unscathed legally, but the whispers grew louder. By 1932, facing increasing complaints and investigations, including an accusation of stealing electric power from the town grid, he resigned as mayor and left Ville. Even those who liked Dr. Petiot had to admit there was something odd, maybe even sinister, about him. Petiot, along with his wife Georgette, whom he married in 1927, and young son, relocated to Paris in 1933. In the anonymity of the big city, he hoped to start fresh. And indeed, over the next several years, Dr. Marcel Petiot built a thriving medical practice in Paris, gaining a reputation as a talented physician who treated the poor for free and provided expert care to anyone who needed it. He settled into a comfortable life in the capital, collecting art and antiques, charming patients with his wit. Outwardly, he appeared the picture of respectability, a family man and doctor who had left behind the troubles of his youth. But even in Paris, Petiot could not suppress his lifelong taste for crime. He defrauded the French welfare system, supplying false medical disability certificates for a fee. He evaded taxes and was fined for overprescribing narcotics. When 2 addicts in his care mysteriously disappeared before they could testify against him, each time the clever doctor wriggled out of serious consequences. By the late 1930s, those who knew Dr. Petiot saw 2 sides to him. Charming healer and conniving crook lived in one body, foreshadowing the much more lethal duality to come. The stage was set. All Petiot needed was the right chaotic environment to unleash the full extent of his depravity. In 1940, history provided that environment, the Nazi occupation of Paris. Paris, under German occupation, was a city trapped in a slow-burning nightmare. When the Nazis marched into Paris in June 1940, an oppressive pall fell over the City of Light. By the waning days of World War II, life in Paris had become a daily trial of fear, distrust, and desperation. Nazi flags hung from balconies. Jackbooted soldiers patrolled the boulevards. Blackout regulations often plunged the city into darkness at night, forcing residents to cover windows and douse lights to avoid drawing Allied bombers. Frequent curfews emptied the streets after sundown, giving Paris an eerie, hushed atmosphere. The populace lived under constant surveillance. The Gestapo and their French collaborators, the Carling cultivated networks of informants, and a careless word could lead to a knock on the door at midnight. For many Parisians, particularly Jews, anti-Nazi resistance, and others deemed undesirable, the city had become a deadly trap. The Nazi regime and Vichy French authorities began rounding up Jews early on. By 1942, mass arrests like the infamous Veldiv roundup sent thousands of Jewish families to near-certain death in the camps. Ordinary people disappeared off the streets regularly. Disappearances became so common they often weren't followed up. Neighbors would whisper that the missing had likely been taken by the Germans or had fled the city. Fear permeated daily life. Many citizens desperately sought escape routes from France, hoping to reach the unoccupied free zone in the south, Spain, Switzerland, or safer abroad. Under these dire conditions, underground networks sprang up, offering to smuggle people out of Paris for a price. For Jews facing deportation, for resistance fighters marked by the Gestapo, or even for petty criminals and deserters. These secret escape lines were a last hope. Of course, con artists and profiteers emerged to prey on that hope. Respect for the law was tarnished under Nazi rule. Few trusted the authorities to help, and criminals found it easy to operate in the shadows. After all, reporting suspicious activity to the French police could be pointless or even dangerous, since the police answered to German overseers. As historian David King noted, Paris was not a good place to be. A lot of people were trying to leave Paris, a lot of people just disappearing. In this climate of dread and uncertainty, Dr. Marcel Petiot saw the opportunity of a lifetime, a way to enrich himself and indulge his bloodiest impulses under cover of wartime chaos. By 1941, Petiot had conceived a devious scheme that perfectly exploited Paris's climate of fear. He would pose as a savior for those most in peril, Jews, resistance members, and others on the run, and then betray them in the most heinous manner. Petiot quietly let it be known on the Parisian black market and through underworld contacts that there was an escape network available for those who could pay. If you were desperate to flee the Nazis, Dr. Eugene could help. That was the alias Petiot chose for himself in these dealings, operating discreetly at first. He cultivated a few trusted intermediaries, including 3 men later identified as Raoul Fourier, Edmond Pintard, and René Incendied, to recruit potential escapees and direct them to him. The code name of Petiot's operation, whispered among those in the know, was Flutox. Fittingly, Flutox was the name of a popular insecticide, and darkly ironic moniker for a scheme that would exterminate human beings like pests. Imagine Paris in 1942, a Jewish family, a husband, wife, and their young Kyle, living in terror after hearing of neighbors taken in Nazi raids. They've exhausted their options. Nowhere in France is safe for them. One day, a friend of a friend quietly introduces the father to a man who can help. There is a doctor, a good Frenchman, who helps people escape. He asks no questions and expects none. It's expensive, but he can save your lives. This was the lure of Dr. Petiot's false escape network. He cultivated a reputation entirely false as a patriotic Robin Hood who would smuggle Jews and resistance fighters to safety. As one witness later recalled of the whispers at the time, this Frenchman comes to the assistance of foreign Jews he does not even know. To the desperate, Dr. Eugene's offer sounded like salvation. The process was straightforward. Petiot's intermediaries quoted a steep price, often 25,000 francs per person, in exchange for passage out of Nazi territory. Clients were instructed to bring all their cash and valuables. The money, they were told, would go partly to bribe officials and partly to support their new start abroad. Petiot's story was that he had connections with diplomats at the Argentine embassy in Paris. Through these contacts, he could arrange for fugitives to be secretly transported to South America, Ushuaia, Buenos Aires, Argentina, Abia, Portugal. It was a golden dream, a ship to freedom in the New World, far from Hitler's grasp. All the travel documents and logistics would be handled by Petiot's network. The clients needed only to pay the fee and trust him, and many did. Why wouldn't they? Dr. Petiot was a licensed physician, affable and apparently well connected. He did indeed have a medical office at 66 Rue Comartin, where he saw ordinary patients by day. If doubts arose, he smoothed them over with practiced ease. According to later testimony, Petiot even had his victims write letters or postcards to relatives before departing, to be mailed from abroad. In these letters, the would-be escapees reassured loved ones that they had safely escaped and would contact them again from neutral territory. It was a clever ruse to delay any search or suspicion. Families would believe the person was en route and simply out of touch for a while. Petiot truly thought of everything. When a client agreed to escape, Dr. Eugene Petiot gave precise instructions. They were usually told to pack their suitcases with clothes and personal belongings for a long journey, but not too many, as travel must be light. Importantly, they must bring all their money, jewelry, and other valuables, since foreign currency and resources would be needed to start their new life in South America. Often the rendezvous was set for nighttime. Since the clandestine operation needed secrecy and Paris's curfew meant fewer prying eyes, Petiot would direct them to come to 21 Rue Le Sueur, his apparently vacant property, at an appointed time. Sometimes he staggered the arrivals. A family might be split up initially, or individuals scheduled at different hours. Petiot often explained that forged travel documents and a safe route had been arranged, but one final step remained before departure. That final step was presented as a health precaution. Petiot, the doctor, told his anxious clients that certain vaccinations or inoculations were required by the countries they'd be passing through. South America, he'd say, had strict health regulations. One needed vaccines against diseases like typhus or yellow fever to enter. Of course, this made sense. Who would question a doctor about vaccines? And so, perhaps in a kitchen or a specially prepared back room, Dr. Petiot would have his client roll up their sleeve for an injection. What the victims did not know was that Petiot was about to administer death itself into their veins. In many cases, Marcel Petiot used his medical expertise to poison his victims swiftly and silently. He would load his syringe with a lethal dose of cyanide or another potent toxin under the guise of a vaccine. Then, with a friendly smile and reassuring words, he injected the unsuspecting escapee. Within moments, the person would succumb. Cyanide acts fast, essentially suffocating cells from the inside. Some victims likely died almost immediately. Others might have collapsed, gasping for breath, as Petiot watched with cold detachment. In a few instances, evidence suggests he may have employed a makeshift gas chamber in the house, an octagonal, soundproof room he had built in the basement, complete with shackles on the walls and a peephole in the door. Investigators later theorized that Petiot might have used this sealed chamber to asphyxiate victims with poison gas. Since no gunshot or stabbing wounds were found on the remains, whether by injection or gas, the outcome was the same. The escapees were murdered at the hands of the very man they trusted. We can only imagine the terror and betrayal in those final moments. The doctor they believed was their savior transforms into a smiling killer. Perhaps a few victims realized something was wrong as the vaccine coursed through their body. A sudden dizziness, a searing pain, the doctor's expression turning eerie. For most, death came too quickly to resist. In one chilling operation, Petiot killed an entire family, the Neller family, including a young boy named René. They had come seeking safe passage. All three perished in Petiot's house. Later, among the heaps of clothing recovered, police found a tiny pair of children's pajamas labeled with René Neller's name, a haunting token of the betrayed hope of that family. With the victims dead, Petiot set about plundering their belongings. He rifled through wallets and purses for cash. Jewelry was pocketed, gold fillings yanked from teeth. Suitcases were opened, and any item of value, furs, dresses, watches, even toys, were set aside. The pitiful remains of these lives were effectively Petiot's spoils. Over time, he accumulated an extraordinary hoard of stolen goods from his victims. In total, authorities later found 72 suitcases and 655 kilograms of clothing and personal items stockpiled at Petiot's properties. This included 1,760 individual pieces of clothing, among them 90 dresses, 120 skirts, 28 men's suits, dozens of hats and ties, 21 woolen overcoats, and that little pair of child's pajamas that testified to the presence of an innocent child among the dead. Petiot had effectively robbed his victims of everything, even the clothes on their backs. Now Dr. Petiot faced the problem of disposing of the bodies. At first, in the early days of his murder scheme, he tried relatively crude methods. He would covertly transport corpses and dump them into the River Seine at night. But floating bodies attract attention, and Petiot grew more ambitious and more grotesque in his approach. By 1941, he purchased the property at 21 Rue Le Sueur, giving himself a private killing ground and disposal site. There, he modified the premises to suit his needs. A stable in the backyard was converted into a body dump, including a deep pit that he filled with quicklime calcium oxide. Quicklime was known, albeit imperfectly, as a substance that could accelerate decomposition by chemically burning flesh. Petiot's courtyard pit became a mass grave, where he could toss bodies to dissolve over weeks. Inside the house, he installed a coal-fired furnace in the basement, effectively an incinerator for human remains. This furnace, and an additional coal stove, would be used to cremate body parts at extremely high heat, albeit at the cost of belching out the foul smoke that eventually drew notice. Petiot developed a gruesome routine: dismemberment, rather than deal with whole corpses. He often butchered the bodies of his victims into smaller pieces for easier burning or dissolving. He became quite skilled with a surgeon's scalpel and bone saw. In fact, when the crime scene at Rue Le Sueur was later examined, investigators were struck by how skillfully dissected some of the remains were. Human heads had their faces flayed off, likely to prevent identification, and hands had fingers and tips removed for the same reason. Petiot clearly did not want his victims to be recognized if any parts were found. He scraped off tattoos, pulled teeth, anything that could serve as an ID. In the basement was a set of large sinks and drains, perfect for catching blood as he worked. The doctor, it seems, applied his medical knowledge in the service of a deranged, methodical body disposal process. After cutting up the corpses, Petiot burned as much as he could in his coal stove and furnace. Neighbors would later recall that at times, an unbearable stench emanated from the house. The sickly sweet odor of roasting flesh that even the cover of night could not entirely hide. When the fires couldn't keep up or the smell grew too obvious, Petiot used the quicklime pit as a backup. He also stuffed body parts into heavy canvas sacks and stored them around the property for later destruction. By early 1944, Petiot had been murdering people at 21 Rue Le Sueur for close to 2 years. It's suspected he killed dozens, perhaps even over 60 victims in total. The majority were Jews in hiding, resistance fighters, and also some ordinary criminals or fugitives who had heard of his escape offer. Tragically, these people went willingly to their deaths, clinging to Petiot's promise of freedom to the very end. All the while, no one reported these missing persons. Why would they? Petiot had engineered it so that relatives expected the victims to vanish. That was the point of an escape network. In Nazi-occupied Paris, a disappearance could mean many things, and fear silenced inquiries. As noted by one commentator, even if you suspected something, a lot of people were very reluctant to go forward, especially if they were Jewish. Indeed, families of Petiot's victims often assumed their loved ones had successfully escaped France and simply could not be contacted due to the war. And any who did worry had nowhere to turn. The police were not to be trusted, and filing a missing person report on someone who was evading the Nazis was unthinkable. This chilling confluence of circumstances allowed Petiot's murder spree to continue unchecked. Paris itself provided the perfect cover, a city where hundreds vanished every week into the maw of war, with barely a ripple. By spring 1943, however, rumors of Petiot's activities reached the wrong ears. The Gestapo got wind of a supposed escape line smuggling Jews out of Paris, and they were not pleased. From the Nazi perspective, anyone helping Jews or resistance flee was thwarting their efforts, and such a network had to be part of the French resistance. Little did they know Petiot's real motives. The Gestapo launched an investigation, eager to crush this escape ring and capture its members. They arrested some of Petiot's associates. Fourier, Pintard, and Nezendet were picked up in May 1943 and brutally tortured for information, under extreme duress. These men eventually revealed the name Dr. Eugene and pointed to Marcel Petiot as the man behind it all. The Gestapo then arrested Dr. Petiot himself. It seemed his murderous enterprise was at an end, but fate intervened in Petiot's favor. The Nazi agents holding Petiot were convinced they'd nabbed a bona fide resistance smuggler, not a serial killer. They interrogated and tortured Petiot for months in prison, trying to force him to give up the names of resistance comrades. In a twisted stroke of luck, Petiot truly had no resistance network to betray. He stoically took the beatings and divulged nothing, because in truth he knew nothing of any resistance cells. His silence under torture only enhanced his captors' belief that he was a hardcore patriot operative. Meanwhile, the Gestapo strangely missed the evidence of his murders. They searched Petiot's main residence, and even Rue Le Sueur, but perhaps failed to dig up the yard or recognize the significance of the lime pit. No bodies were discovered by them. Eventually, after 8 months of fruitless imprisonment, the Nazis let Petiot and his associates go in January 1944. The Gestapo had nothing to charge him with except possibly aiding the enemy, and with no concrete proof of an escape line, all his victims were dead. After all, they released him. Ironically, the torture Petiot endured at Gestapo hands now gave him credibility. To outside eyes, he looked like a genuine resistance hero who had suffered for France. Emboldened and unfazed, Petiot returned to his gruesome work in early 1944. But by that March, he finally pushed his luck too far. The constant smoke and stench from the Rue Le Sueur house, as we saw, drew neighbor complaints. Petiot had been on a frenetic killing and disposal binge, perhaps trying to eliminate remaining bodies after his prison stay. It all led to the horrific discovery by the French police on March 11, 1944. The heaps of dismembered bodies, the quicklime pit of decomposing corpses, the sacks of remains strewn about. Investigators at the scene counted body parts from at least 10 victims initially. But as one coroner remarked to the press, the number 10 is vastly inferior to the real one. In total, 23 distinct victims' remains would be identified in that house, mostly through painstaking forensic work and personal effects. Though Petiot is suspected of killing far more, possibly on the order of 60 or more people. That night, as Marcel Petiot vanished into the dark city, the French authorities faced a ghastly puzzle and a public relations nightmare. The newspapers got wind of the sensational find almost immediately. Paris woke up to shocking headlines: 27 corpses discovered in doctor's home, Dr. Petiot on the run. In a city already steeped in terror, the idea of a serial killer stalking victims under cover of war was almost unbelievable. The French media dubbed him Dr. Satan, the very embodiment of evil hiding behind a doctor's mask. A media circus ensued, with coverage reaching as far as neutral Switzerland and Sweden. Parisians were horrified and transfixed. In the midst of war's carnage, another predator had been lurking in their midst, one who preyed not on random victims, but specifically on those most vulnerable and hopeful. With the gruesome discovery at Rue Le Sueur, Marcel Petiot became the most wanted man in France, but capturing him would prove frustratingly difficult. In the immediate aftermath, as we saw, the French police had hesitated, partly due to Petiot's clever manipulation, posing as a resistance avenger, and partly due to an order from the German military command to arrest him. In those chaotic last months of occupation, the French police were torn between obeying their German superiors and quietly sympathizing with resistance. Petiot exploited that confusion masterfully. By the time the truth of his crimes emerged, he had a valuable head start. For the next 7 months, Dr. Petiot disappeared into the shadows of Paris. The city was still occupied until late summer 1944, making movement tricky, but Petiot had a network of loyal friends and former patients willing to hide him. He grew out his beard, altering his clean-cut appearance into that of a shaggy, unkempt older man. He adopted various aliases and moved safe house to safe house. One of his patients, Georges Redoubt, sheltered him for a time. Petiot convinced Redoubt that the Gestapo was hunting him because he had killed Germans and informers. A lie that was credible given Petiot's recent imprisonment by the Nazis. Petiot went out only at night, and sometimes he returned to the hideout brandishing weapons, claiming he'd taken them off German patrols he ambushed. In truth, he likely hadn't harmed any Nazi soldiers at all, but his host believed he was living with a fearless resistance hero. August 1944 arrived, and with it, the liberation of Paris. As Allied forces neared, Parisians rose in revolt against the German occupiers. In this tumultuous period, Petiot saw a perfect opportunity to reinvent himself in plain sight. Shedding one of his fake identities for another, he emerged as Henri Valéry, a staunch patriot, ready to fight the retreating Germans. Incredibly, Petiot, as Valéry joined the newly formed French forces of the Interior FFI, the Amalgamated Resistance Militia, during the uprising. With his confident manner and apparent zeal, He secured a position as a captain in charge of counterespionage and prisoner interrogations in the liberated city. In other words, Marcel Petiot, mass murderer, now strode about Paris in an FFI uniform hunting for Nazi collaborators and even participating in their interrogations and executions. The irony is staggering. A man who had slaughtered innocents under the guise of resistance work was now officially in the resistance, given authority to root out traitors. For a brief time, Captain Henry Valeri played his role with gusto. He no doubt relished the power and the continued cloak of legitimacy. But Petiot's brazen gamble couldn't last forever. In September 1944, about a month after liberation, an incident occurred that began to unravel his new identity. Two members of the FFI under Petiot's command committed a robbery murder. They killed a local mayor and stole a fortune in cash and stamps. When witnesses reported it, Petiot Valeri bizarrely interfered with the investigation, jailing the witnesses and ensuring the culprits were released and disappeared with their loot. His overreach drew some suspicion within FFI circles. Then came the pivotal moment. A popular French newspaper called Resistance ran an expose about the wanted butcher of Paris, Dr. Marcel Petiot, who was still at large. The article painted Petiot not as a hero, but as a soldier of the Reich, accusing him of heinous crimes, including working with the Nazis to entrap Jews. This was a highly provocative piece, likely intended to flush Petiot out or force the authorities to act. Petiot, ever prideful, couldn't resist responding. He wrote an indignant letter to his former lawyer, René Floriot, who had defended him in a minor case back in 1942, denying all the newspaper's allegations. In the letter, he sputtered that the Resistance article was nothing but filthy kraut lies. Floriot received this bizarre correspondence and, realizing it was from none other than the fugitive Petiot, alerted the police. Crucially, the letter confirmed that Petiot was indeed in Paris and even hinted at his possible alias. Since Floriot knew his client wasn't signing letters as Marcel Petiot, the French police, now free of German oversight and keen to capture this notorious killer, reinvigorated their hunt. They suspected Petiot might be hiding within the ranks of the very resistance forces helping to look for him. Indeed, Captain Valeri himself was assigned to the manhunt for Petiot, a delicious irony that Petiot surely appreciated for a time. But the net was tightening. On October 31, 1944, at around 10:15 a.m., the masquerade ended. At a Paris metro station, some accounts say it was Saint-Mans station. An officer on the lookout recognized Petiot Valeri and moved to arrest him. Petiot tried to pull a pistol, but he was subdued before he could shoot. In his pockets, he carried 31,700 francs in cash and 50 sets of identity documents, a testament to his life on the run and the multiple personas he had crafted. The butcher of Paris was finally in custody. After nearly 7 months of eluding justice, Marcel Petiot, gaunt, bearded, and defiant, would now have to answer for his crimes. In the spring of 1946, the eyes of France turned to Room 1 of the Palais de Justice in Paris, where Marcel Petiot's trial unfolded like a morbid theater. By now, Petiot's exploits had made him infamous nationwide. The press had labeled him Dr. Satan, and public fascination with the case was immense. Security was tight. After all, this was a man who claimed to have killed Nazis and collaborators. There were fears someone might seek vigilante revenge, or that Petiot might attempt some mad escape. Neither happened. Instead, Marcel Petiot reveled in the spotlight of his trial, conducting his defense with a mix of cunning, bravado, and gallows humor that left observers by turns appalled and astonished. On March 19, 1946, Petiot was brought to trial before the Seine-Assize Court, charged with 135 criminal counts, including at least 27 counts of murder. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' relatives, and curious Parisians. Petiot had secured as his defense attorney the famous René Floriot, the same lawyer who'd received Petiot's furtive letter. Floriot, a celebrity lawyer, now faced the near-impossible task of saving a man widely presumed to be a monster. Across from him stood a battery of prosecutors and no fewer than 12 civil party lawyers hired by families of Petiot's victims. It was clear that France wanted justice, and Petiot's trial would be the catharsis after the trauma of the war and his crimes. From the outset, Dr. Petiot maintained an air of blithe confidence. He sat in the dock often with a smirk, twirling his bushy mustache. He had shaved the wild beard by then, and responding to questions with sarcastic quips. His strategy was audacious: complete denial of murder for profit, complete insistence on his story of being a resistance hero. In Petiot's telling, he had never killed innocents. Oh no, he claimed that every person who ended up dead at 21 Rue Le Sueur was either a German soldier, a Gestapo agent, or a French traitor who got what they deserved. He painted himself as a lone warrior who ran a renegade resistance operation, eliminating enemies of France. "I have killed only enemies of my country," Petiot declared. In effect, according to him, the real culprits behind the murdered Jews were still out there. He implied that his victims, who were clearly Jewish or refugees, must have actually escaped and were living under new names in South America. He went so far as to claim that some of the missing were double agents or Nazi collaborators themselves, whom he had dispatched as part of patriotic duty. This fantastical narrative met with deep skepticism. The prosecutors meticulously laid out evidence of Petiot's fraud and greed, the enormous stash of valuables taken from victims, the sums of money involved, the fact that none of the identified victims were proven German agents at all. Most were Jewish civilians. They emphasized the absurdity of Petiot's claims. If he was resistance, where were his resistance comrades? In fact, no major resistance group had ever heard of Dr. Eugene, and many groups he named were fictitious. Petiot had no answer beyond conspiratorial shrugging. As testimony proceeded, a parade of witnesses, family members of victims, neighbors from Rue Le Sueur, forensic experts, painted the picture of Petiot's cold-blooded activities. One plaintiff's attorney, Pierre Varin, gave a damning summation. He lured the desperate, the frightened, to his lair and murdered them. There was no patriotism here, only predation. Throughout the trial, Petiot couldn't resist his instinct to taunt and jest. He sparred with the prosecutors, often answering questions with glib retorts. When asked about specific victims, he'd smirk and suggest they were alive abroad, or claim they were collaborating scum who deserved death. At one point he proclaimed he had 63 enemies on his kill list, a higher number than the 27 murders he was charged with, essentially boasting about more killings. He quickly clarified that these were all Germans or collaborators. He needled the lawyers representing victims' families, implying their loved ones were criminals or that greed led them to him. Such cruelty in the face of grieving relatives made the spectators gasp. Yet, even in his arrogance, Petiot did admit to certain facts, carefully chosen ones. Under pressure, he conceded that he had, in fact, killed 19 of the people whose remains were found in his house. But he stuck to his line that those 19 were enemies of France. It was a bizarre partial confession, likely an attempt to appear truthful while preserving his resistance myth. No one was convinced. The judges and jury saw through Marcel Petiot's performance. The man on the stand was no patriot avenger. He was a thief and a mass murderer, and his own words damned him as much as any evidence. After a dramatic 16-day trial, the verdict was delivered. Marcel Petiot was found guilty on 26 counts of murder, the discrepancy from 27 due to one count being dropped or merged. The other charges, theft, fraud, etc., were virtually moot in the face of the murder convictions. The court concluded that Petiot had killed for financial gain, exploiting the most vulnerable. They utterly rejected his self-serving fairy tale of resistance work. The judge pronounced the only penalty appropriate: death. Petiot took the sentence with a shrug, reportedly saying, "I have nothing to say." When asked if he had any final remarks to the court, but his dark sense of humor didn't abandon him. As he was let out, he told his lawyer Floriat not to bother appealing, quipping that it wasn't worth the effort. "My head could be at stake," he had said upon first seeing the basement carnage, and indeed, it was. In the grey dawn of May 25, 1946, at La Santé prison in Paris, 49-year-old Marcel Petiot faced the guillotine. The execution was scheduled just before sunrise in the prison courtyard, as was customary. A small group gathered to witness: the chief executioner, his aides, a priest, a doctor, and a handful of officials. Petiot had spent his last days writing rambling letters professing his innocence and maintaining his absurd patriotic pose. But now, at the end, even he seemed to recognize the futility. Lead from his cell, Petiot approached the gleaming guillotine apparatus, the infamous national razor of France, with an almost cheerful demeanor. According to later reports, as the executioners made their final preparations, Petiot offered a sly bit of advice to those nearby. "Gentlemen, I have one last piece of counsel. Step back, because this will not be a pretty sight." It was classic Petiot, sardonic, flippant, even in the face of his own death. Those were essentially his last words. A moment later, just before 5 a.m., Marcel Petiot was placed on the bascule board. The heavy blade was hoisted, and with a swift fall and a sharp thud, Dr. Satan was beheaded. The man who had brought so many others to a gruesome end met his fate in the same city he had terrorized. His execution had been delayed briefly due to a mechanical issue with the guillotine's release mechanism, but in the end, the blade did its work. Justice, as measured by the law, was done. After the execution, Petiot's remains were buried quickly in every cemetery. Paris. There was no mournful crowd, no public funeral, only a collective sigh of relief from a nation eager to put this horrifying chapter behind it. In total, Marcel Petiot was officially confirmed to have murdered 26 people, though he claimed at least 63, and suspicions of dozens more unsolved disappearances will forever linger. His crimes during the occupation stand among the most depraved atrocities by an individual in French history, made all the more sinister by the way he weaponized hope and trust as his tools of murder. In the aftermath, the Petiot case became the stuff of legend and nightmares. Parents would warn misbehaving children about Dr. Satan. True crime books and films recounted the story of the respectable doctor who turned out to be a sadistic killer. But beyond the lurid fascination lies a deeper cautionary tale. Even in times of darkness and chaos, perhaps especially in such times, evil can wear a friendly face. Marcel Petiot thrived in the Nazi occupation because he understood how to manipulate fear, need, and hope. He offered sanctuary and delivered oblivion. Let the final images linger in our minds. A once trusting refugee, realizing too late the syringe was filled with poison. A small furnace belching black smoke and the sickly smell of death. Suitcases piled high, never to be reclaimed by their owners. A courtroom where a murderer insists he's a patriot. And a dark Paris morning where the blade falls on a man who betrayed all codes of humanity. The story of Marcel Petiot is a real-life horror, a psychological thriller played out in history's darkest hour. It forces us to confront the unsettling truth that monsters sometimes hide in plain sight, smiling kindly and promising deliverance, even as they lead their victims to the abyss. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. See you next time.